invited 5 representatives of several theological backgrounds to respond to this small but quite profound question. How do you value the influence of Hauerwas' theology in the Netherlands? And they will each talk about 50 minutes. The first we will listen to is Professor Herman Paul. He is Associate Professor of Historical Theory at Leiden University and holds a special chair in Sexualization Studies at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, University of Groningen, and is member of the Young Academy. He introduced, as a matter of fact, Stanley Hauerwas in the Netherlands in the volume Plaats, and you probably might have read those interviews, which contains also an interview with Stanley Hauerwas. And he edited a volume with translated articles by Hauerwas and Robuuste Kerk. May I kindly invite you to address us all, Herman.
Thank you, Hans, for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, if a tree is known by its fruit, as the Gospel says, what is the fruit by which Stanley Hauerwas can be known? Although Hauerwas is a fruitful theologian in all kinds of ways, academics are not seldom inclined to equate scholarly fruit with views in print, that is, with arguments and positions laid down in writing. In this view, the fruit that Hauerwas has been yielding since his first book, more than 40 years ago, consists of theological views on narrative, virtue, character, church, and a host of other contested themes. A quite characteristic example of this approach is offered by Hauerwas' Wikipedia entry, which is structured in sections entitled Basic Theological and Philosophical Views, Views on Human Experimentation, Views on Death and Dying Well, and Views of Patience and Courage. If this will be our preferred perspective for engaging with Hauerwas today, our principal question would be, what has Hauerwas written on X, Y, or Z? Arguably, however, this understanding of the fruit that Hauerwas has been yielding is a rather limited one. A more encompassing approach would include the students that Hauerwas has been teaching, the dissertations written under his supervision, the response his work has elicited, the inspiration it has provided, and the changes in church and academy to which Hauerwas has contributed, intentionally or not. What matters in this second approach is not primarily what Hauerwas wrote on page 25 of Character and the Christian Life, but rather how he has contributed to what Luke Brereton calls an ecclesial turn in Christian ethics and political theology, or how his interventions have helped others to regain renewed confidence in Christian language and liturgy. Speaking about fruit, one only needs to browse through a journal like Studies in Christian Ethics to realize that much of current work in the field would have been unthinkable without Stanley Hauerwas. Let me illustrate the difference between these two modes of reading, as well as their interaction, by explaining how Hauerwas encourages critical reflection on secularization. Admittedly, the term secularization does not figure prominently in his writings. Yet in his 2007 book, The State of the University, Hauerwas speaks about secularization not as shorthand for a grand-scale narrative of religious decline, or as synonymous to rationalization and differentiation of society, but rather as a technical term for the rise to prominence of a mode of time, the world's time, that does not reckon with the new age that has been inaugurated in Jesus Christ, the church's time, as he calls it. The secular, then, does not denote a spatial realm, but a temporal regime or a mode of life shaped through stories that seek closure prior to the eschaton. If this is what secularization entails, then the bulk of Hauerwas' oeuvre can be seen as directed against secularization. In particular against secularization as it manifests itself in a church that is perennially tempted to exchange its church's time for the world's time, in conscious or non-conscious attempts at being relevant, fashionable, or up-to-date. For decades already, Hauerwas has been warning against the corruption that results from such a watering down of Christian practice as illustrated by the following passage from a lecture I heard Hauerwas deliver at Princeton Theological Seminary back in 2007. I quote, "How many of you worship in a church with an American flag? I'm sorry to tell you, your salvation is in doubt. How many of you worship in a church in which the 4th of July is celebrated? I'm sorry to tell you, your salvation is in doubt. How many of you worship in a church that recognizes Thanksgiving? I'm sorry to tell you, your salvation is in doubt." Hauerwas has taught me at least 4 things about secularization so defined. First, he has taught me the Augustinian lesson that the church as we encounter it, with or without American flag next to the pulpit, is always a corpus mixtum, and that attempts at purification of this mixture testify to an impatience that is characteristic of the world's time more than of the church's time. Secondly, Hauerwas has made me aware that secularization is not a topic that allows for black and white distinctions between them and us. The distinction between church and world in terms of temporal regimes is a distinction within my own life, or within the conflicting commitments characteristic of the life I'm living. Speaking about shaping in the third place, I think that Hauerwas has made me increasingly aware of the formative power of what James Smith calls cultural liturgies, those of capitalist consumer culture and academic meritocracy in particular. And finally, he has offered me a vocabulary for thinking about the need as well as the nature of Christian counterformation in practices such as those that are central to Hauerwas' 1983 book, The Peaceable Kingdom. Practices of gathering on Sunday morning, reading the Bible, receiving the sacraments, and giving our offerings. However, on this issue of counterformation or Christian character formation, aimed at directing our lives away from the secular towards God and His kingdom, I've taken the freedom a couple of years ago to comment in print on what I perceived as a somewhat remarkable irony in Hauerwas' work. The irony is that Hauerwas seeks to challenge our inner worldly lives, but tends to describe the practices needed for such a reorientation in terms that often are equally inner worldly. Especially in his early work from the 1970s and 1980s, Hauerwas conceives of Christian character formation near exclusively in terms of language learning, imitation of examples, and often repeated exposure to Christian practices. And he talks of God as the one who calls people unto him and gives them what they need for being his disciples, is remarkably absent. Although Hauerwas has or had reasons for avoiding such God talk, simply said he is afraid of abuse, the solution of focusing our attention on God's gift, the church, rather than on the giver, may well have the unintended consequence of confirming an understanding of the world and ourselves in which God appears as marginal at best. I'm therefore sympathetic to an argument put forward in various forms by younger theologians loosely affiliated with the Hauerwas school, such as Bernd Wannewetz and Brian Brock. They argue that our inner worldly frames of reference are so strongly anchored in our economy of desire that only a God-given desire for God can liberate us from their power. More concretely, they argue that the Church cannot have any hope of instilling such a desire of God in our hearts if it keeps silent about Him. We need God talk, in prayer and praise especially, in order to challenge our secular comfort zones. I'm sorry that phrase turns up here in my talk. And it is at this point, I think, that my distinction between two kinds of fruit becomes relevant. If I read Hauerwas as a thinker on his own, the foregoing may well be formulated in terms of criticism. The second approach, though, which sees Hauerwas as part of a movement across time and space, would highlight that questions, corrections, and refinements proposed by former students depend on Hauerwas' intervention in the first place. Wannewetz and Brock, not to mention a host of others, would not have been able to write what they write without the writings of their former teacher. Consequently, it would be more appropriate to thank Hauerwas, or to thank God for Hauerwas, than to criticize some 30 to 40-year-old books that have elicited such fruitful response. But finally, if you think this leaves us with a solid distinction between Hauerwas and Hauerwas' theology as it has been carried forward by his students, you forget how much Stan likes to challenge seemingly stable distinctions. Hauerwas resembles Hayden White, the American philosopher of history on whom I wrote my first book, in that he keeps writing and proposing new ideas so as to render premature any attempt at interpretive closure at the part of his readers. Thus, a couple of months ago, Hauerwas sent me an email message, rather out of the blue, in which he responded to the reservations that I just briefly summarized, and alerted me to his new book, The Holy Spirit, which he said attempted to address the issue of agency. Lo and behold, this turned out to be a book indeed that speaks as confidently about the Spirit as one can hope for. It explicates what has remained implicit for so many years. That, I quote, the Church exists only because the Holy Spirit animates our lives, bringing into existence the Church, unquote. All sorts of familiar Hauerwas themes re-emerge in his little book: witness, discipleship, living out of control. But now on the regarding question how these can be thought of as fruits of the Spirit, the most important fruit a Christian can possibly bear, of course. Is this then Hauerwas' response to his former students, to questions and criticisms raised by friends and colleagues? What a fruitful response from a theologian who had already brought forth such an abundance of fruit. Thank you.